Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Michael. And I'll just dive right in and talk about how it is that Angela and I came to the decision to write about these four artists who were working in New York in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Photographer George Platt Lynes, and the three painters who made photographs of each other as PaJaMa, Paul Cadmus, Jared French, and Margaret French. I first started looking in depth at the work of these artists in preparation for my 2018 exhibition at the Whitney Museum, Transmissions, which, one second, trying to, okay. That was an exhibition that really honed in on the intersection of visual arts and performance in New York at mid-century to uncover the queer core of American modernism. And following that exhibition, in which I featured Lynes' work very centrally, I still had a lot of questions about his work in particular and its place in our culture. I felt like I had just scratched the surface of this artist's work, and I wanted to understand why Lynes was not fully canonized in the way that his peers were.
Thank you. Thanks again for the introduction, and hello to everyone in the audience. We're going to be going back and forth between Lynes and PaJaMa because of the nature of this talk and of the book, and also jumping back and forth between ourselves. So I'll jump in here and go to the first image of Lincoln Kirstein. I first became interested in PaJaMa while working on a book on the queer circle of Lincoln Kirstein, very distinguished figure of much interest. And beginning in the late 1930s and forward, Kirstein was also at the center of these converging networks of artists and dancers and writers that included our four artists. They were part of a very closely knit circle of social intimates, and they all became each other's subjects in the art that they made collaboratively. And the photographic work that Lynes and PaJaMa did then, as Michael mentioned, it's never really been studied in parallel. It's never really been studied in relation to one another, or in terms of how these two sets of artists began to really mutually influence one another, coming out of the same intimate circle and working in the same environment. So both of us became very engaged with how these various queer lives and ways of working intersected, how the work, in other words, how the work of any single artist could only be understood really within this broader artistic and social and interpersonal world in which they all navigated, and which was very sustaining for them. And we found that all of them were involved in, very fluid exchanges, not only between painting and photography and dance, but also a kind of broader creative fluidity that crossed the boundaries between work and play, between popular and high art, popular media and high art, and also between private and public lives. So they, in many ways, they were kind of working between these boundaries and among these categories. And that, as we looked at that, we started to think that that was part of their, an aspect of their queerness as a group. Just let me introduce you to the three figures that formed PaJaMa. They were all painters. So unlike Lynes, none of them thought of themselves as photographers. And I'll talk about how they actually used the camera in very different ways. And these are the three figures. Margaret French in her clown costume, you'll see her as a circus performer a little later. But they use photography as a medium through which to experiment with various forms of figural staging that then made its way into their painting. And you see, maybe go back to that earlier work. The ways in which here you have Jared French in the shower, and how that image for shots works its way into Paul Cadmus's painting done on Fire Island in 1943. And then we have a couple of other examples. Here we have Jared French, Paul Cadmus being sort of voyeuristically gazed at by Margaret French in a staging. And then you see the same kind of tattered t-shirt that finds its way into a studio photograph set up by George Platt Lynes.
Well, I want to interrupt you, Angela. We're not sure if it finds its way into the studio or vice versa.
Right, exactly. We don't know the direction of the transit, and it's a different T-shirt, but it's the idea of the torn T-shirt, and you can see the sort of interchange between them. And then that image, in turn, the staged image done on the dunes, finds its way into the work of Jared French. And French was probably the one who was taking the photograph you just saw. And here you see a similar staging with very different subjects that works its way into his painting. Now, most of these PaJaMa images were made outside, at least the ones that we're going to be talking about, on the beaches of Fire Island, but also Provincetown and Nantucket. In other words, these northern Atlantic coastal environments where these three artists spent their summers, leaving New York and living together and working together. And I think it's important, I wanted to add in relation to how they use these photographs in staging, that we should be careful not to think of them simply as source material, because they're much more. And you can see that in this image here, that there's no counterpart to this image in the work. It's a beautifully staged image, and it's one of the better known and more widely published of this archive, showing George Tooker, and I believe Jared French, and then Monroe Wheeler, who will reappear shortly, but part of this circle of intimates that summer together on the island. So they were made on the beaches, and they have a kind of playful quality because they were often staged at the end of the workday of these three as painters, these three members of PaJaMa. And the photographs that I write about in the book, in my essay, were really only a smaller subset of a very large archive of photographs that are still being collected and assembled and organized. It's very hard to sort of chart in any stable way what this archive consisted of, because there were many aspects to it. There were travel shots, there were snapshots, there were outdoor and indoor stagings that engaged a wide variety of friends within this circle. So it's a very, very large archive, and I was only really covering one aspect of it. Here are another image. This is a beautiful image. And these were never intended for public exhibition. I think that's an important point to keep in mind, that this archive of PaJaMa was really circulated privately among friends, and not really ever intended at the time to be exhibited. They're very small. They were often gifted to friends who then collected them into albums. And those albums were put together by various people in the group. Actually, could you go back to to that one? You saw this earlier, but they seem, looking at an image like this, it seems rather inaccessibly private. There is this kind of enigmatic quality about these images that I think has stumped people over the years, because indeed they were made for a circle of friends, private circle of friends who did share a kind of collective knowledge and understanding about the conditions and the context in which they were made. But to outsiders, people outside of that framework, outside of that circle, they were often very difficult and enigmatic images. They were small in scale, often 4 to 5 inches or 6 to 8 inches. And as I said, they were collected into albums. And there's only one example that I know of an intact album, and that is in the possession of a New York gallery. It was made by the writer Glenway Westcott. This is a page from Westcott's album, which he made with his lifetime partner, Monroe Wheeler, who was the director of publications at the Museum of Modern Art. So these photographs don't really fit, as you see the examples that you've seen, they don't really fit into any of the established categories or genres of photographic practice at the time, which I think is part of what has kind of stumped people. Here we see a behind the scenes photograph of the staging of one of these photographs. So staging was one of their primary practices, as we'll talk about. And you see Jared French, who's acting almost like a film director. He's stooping over, he's arranging a rope over the figure of George Platt Lynes, and you see Glenway Westcott in the back, and then you see Paul Cadmus. And in the foreground, you see the outline, the silhouette of Margaret French, who's the one documenting, it's probably Margaret French, documenting this scene of a scene being staged. Yeah.
So in comparison, Lynes's photographs, of course, look very different. They have the studio polish and high-keyed glamour. But as we just saw in Angela's last slide, Lynes engaged in this impromptu photo play of PaJaMa. So the question arises, what connected that mode of working to his own way of making images? And one thing I noticed in the literature around Lynes is that it tends to be addressed in distinct categories. People talk about his fashion photographs, his portraits of novelists, composers, movie stars, his fashion images, his sort of quasi-surrealist photomontages. I mean, you can see it's a wide range of images, his ballet photographs, his nudes. And of course, he is well known as a photographer and acknowledged as a forebear to Mapplethorpe, Avedon, Hujar, and others. But little work has been done to contextualize Lynes in the history of photography, or really the history of art. People haven't thought about what unites Lynes's work across its multiple categories. And I started noticing these repetitions in the work, particular settings that were used for very different kinds of representations, such as, in this case, this ingenious use of an unfurled ball of twine to create an environment both for a fashion shoot and then for another shoot with the ballet dancer Ralph McWilliams, whose draped sweater evokes a backless evening gown. But obviously that's an image that has not been commissioned or made for use by the New York City Ballet, but for another purpose. Another thing I noticed is that in contemporary studies of Lynes, people like to talk about the fact that his nudes are separate from the more known bodies of work, the portraits and the fashion photographs. And that assumption is based on the claim that the nudes had to be made in secret due to the increasing panic around what was termed the lavender scare and the attendant social and legal risks associated with being an out homosexual or producing homoerotic images. But I found this narrative of secrecy a bit confounding because Lynes sent very publicly queer signals in his fashion photographs and portraits. And if you look at the photography annuals that he frequently contributed to, such as this one, and his photographs in the case of this particular issue of Photographie are shown alongside the work of Man Ray, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Ansel Adams, and many others. You can see that he's juxtaposing his portrait of the painter Marc Chagall with an existentially inflected homoerotic image in 1947. So this may be a niche publication, but it's still very public. So I felt that maybe things were less clear-cut than we're assuming from our present-day vantage point. And the queerness in Lynes's work, I believe, is not actually located in the subjects, such as the overt eroticism of a male nude, but in how they were made across multiple and often hybridized genres. And there is a whole historiography of secrecy and the closet at play here, especially in Lynes's work, but also in PaJaMa's that Angela and I can talk about later. But I really wanted to think about how our understanding of Lynes's work could change if we give up on the idea that the work is compartmentalized, and what happens if we treat it instead as very deliberate, precise, calculated, and cross-referenced. To read the work as not the byproduct of a repressive society, but the work of an artist with a very strong and clear sense of agency and the means to circumvent and play with certain limits. One of the images I discuss in this book is the fashion photograph on the left for Henri Bendel. The drawings you see behind the model are not arbitrary or anonymous surrogates for art. They're the work of a specific artist named Alexander Jensen Yao. And he was a frequent model for Lynes, assisted with the construction and painting of sets in his studio, modeled in PaJaMa photographs, as well as in Cadmus paintings. And he also lived as Lincoln Kirstein's lover in the elegant townhouse Kirstein shared with his wife, Fidel McCadmus, who was Paul Cadmus's sister. And Lynes often staged fashion photographs in that house among their collected art objects. So this kind of signaling to a highly networked queer world happens all over Lynes's work. And the way in which he does it usually is by inserting an artwork or a portrait into the photograph beside a live model. So that's one of the ways in which Lynes exaggerates the power of innuendo in his work, multiplying the number of real and implied subjects within the frame of each photograph. Here you have the model, the representation of a person not in the same time space as the model, and unseen in the photograph, you have the presence of the photographer behind the camera, creating a triad. And portraiture is such an important category that kind of gets exploded in Lynes's work, and one of the categories most frequently played with and subverted in modernist art, music and literature. Here's another example of a Bendel's advertisement for aftershave lotion this time, and that's published in a ballet program. And you see Lynes again signaling to multiple audiences that sort of cropped smoking face behind the bottle of aftershave is in fact Lynes himself, but it's not a self-portrait that he's using here. He's using a photograph that was made of him by another important photographer of the period who was his friend, Cecil Beaton. And hold on, if you look here, you can see the signatures of each artist on the corners of the photographs, which is this kind of strange convention of how photography was shown and authored at the time, almost like painting. So here's another example of how Lynes played actually quite publicly with his authorship and allowed his interfiliated world to surface into public spaces. So looking at these multiple ways in which Lynes conflated and expanded the role of portraiture in his work led me to think about the larger economy of gifted and commissioned portraits in his circle. And that, of course, includes the trading and gifting of PaJaMa photographs, where renderings of members of these artistic circles in drawings, paintings, and photographs literally created the feeling of being seen at a time when that was culturally taboo.
Thank you. Nick, you just mentioned this kind of triadic structure in the Bendel photograph. There's kind of invisible third person. And the ways in which some third person is often insinuated into the staging of the composition, in this case, the Zhen Xiao, along with the photographer. And I want to talk a little bit then, just playing off that idea, that there is something that I observed in many of these photographs, a kind of triadic structure in many of them, especially ones that I write about, that appears and reappears. And it's another point of connection, I think, between Lynes and PaJaMa, is this triadic structure. And also, I came to think of this. This is somewhat speculative, but I came to think of this as the ways in which these three artists really are following a kind of set of protocols or even rules that those inside of the circle recognized and understood. A bit like games, playing games, you have certain rules that you play by. And one of these rules, I think, for the sake of brevity, called the rule of three, that because Paul, Jared, and Margaret entered this creative field as a threesome, as PaJaMa, the images they created together would somehow always contain, or very often contain, not always, but very often contain a kind of triangular structure of some kind. In this case, it could be an old weathered stairway. And if you look at this, there are multiple kind of triangles and triangulated forms. And there are also a group of three interfiliated lives. And then another instance, this is a particularly weird photograph. It's hard to explain. And but Margaret is creating the hypotenuse of a triangle by holding out that rope. And then you also see a kind of triangulation of the figures in depth, in the spatial depth of the photograph. And then I think there's one other. Yeah, this is a really weird photograph. It's just like, how do you explain these? They seem quite enigmatic until you start to think that, well, maybe there is, a kind of game going on where people in the circle would come to anticipate where's the triangle going to occur. There's going to be a triangular form of some form entering into these photographs. In this case, this is Lynes and his boyfriend at the time, Jonathan Tickner, standing on these triangulated sawhorses, but there's a third invisible person, which if you know the story behind the scenes, which those in the circle did know, which is that Jonathan was the brother of George Platt Lynes's lover, who was killed in World War II. And he then took up with his brother in his period of grieving. So there's a kind of invisible third person here. So that's the sort of rule of three. And finally, just to say that three, I think we can sort of toy with the idea that three was a queer number, and that maybe perhaps they were playing with that as well in queering these. I think, yeah. So another thing that brought that they shared, PaJaMa and Lynes shared, is that neither one of them were hobbled by the camera as an instrument for reproducing the real. The kind of indexical status of the camera was something that they didn't bother with. And they're rather like there are surrealist moments in a number of these photographs where they may actually be channeling sort of surrealist tropes. And but what's different, what differentiates PaJaMa from the surrealists is that PaJaMa is consistently using staging rather than, say, darkroom procedures or burning out or double exposure, the kinds of techniques that the surrealists were using. PaJaMa is consistently using staging. In this case, Margaret, who drapes herself with this strange luminous white fabric next to this very bizarre and intrinsically surreal piece of driftwood, enormous piece of driftwood that sort of looms over her, and that they used in a number of other settings. Driftwood was a sort of found object, or I think, as Nick calls it, a kind of dream architecture that they used in order to spark the imagination. And they did this again through staging as a primary working method. And a creative tool for both Lynes and for PaJaMa.
I think it's so interesting the way you think about the triad and triangulation formally, but also sort of psychologically, or as a kind of insinuation of an absent person. And there was so much in the writing of this book and in our dialogue, Angela, I think that had to do with getting into the logic of how these images were made. Yeah. And one thing that may seem very obvious, but that I think is important to remember is that the PaJaMa photographs especially were made by the act of sharing a camera, passing it around. And I think that's really central to these artists, that they let go of the apparatus, which is also letting go of the notion of the professional. And I mean, that's also just a recent possibility, of course, with the market availability of handheld cameras. But Lynes also had ways of doing that. He would, give over control of the shutter release to certain of his collaborators. And then in this next example, we can talk about that a little more in depth. These are pages of scrapbooks, Lynes scrapbooks in the collection of the Beinecke Library. That really show, or serve as an example of the mutual influences that these four artists exerted on one another. And I had seen individual images from the scrapbook floating around in the world over the years, some, blown up at different scales. Lynes prolifically reproduced lots of his images and kind of distributed them through various channels. But a lot of times I'd see these images also as attributed to PaJaMa because they so obviously look like PaJaMa in the Fire Island setting. And it just took me a while to understand what was actually going on here. And once I saw the pages of these scrapbooks at the library, I realized, oh, this is Lynes making images in the style of PaJaMa, among them and with them. What you see here on the left is kind of the state that the images are in now. They're these, individual cutout contact, medium format contact prints. So what I had to do was to reconstitute the original arrangements, configurations on the page of the scrapbooks using old records and Lynes's annotation. But that kind of gives more of a sense of what these sessions were like, involving a lot of Lynes staging himself, and then kind of blending into more PaJaMa-like scenarios. And so what I think is remarkable about these pages is what they say about PaJaMa's willingness to go along with this activity. They didn't see their practice as sacrosanct, or they didn't feel proprietary about it. It was a game, as Angela suggested, or a set of protocols that anyone in their friend group might use or participate in. And so, again, seeing these, I try to understand how they might not just be an isolated incident, but how these series of photographs would tie into Lynes's broader practice. And I realized that one of the compositions from the Fire Island scrapbooks on Fire Island was actually restaged by Lynes in his studio with the Hollywood film star Gloria Swanson. Here you can see side by side the original incident with Paul Cadmus, and then the studio photograph with Gloria Swanson. So that's evidence of, a whole set of processes of Lynes, in the studio, remembering this artistic identity that he had inhabited with his friends, but then also the deliberate transport of the material, the washed up, weathered trellis from Fire Island and the driftwood back to his studio in Manhattan to incorporate into his studio sessions.
Thank you. And there you can see more of that driftwood on the right.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing here then, I think, is one of the key practices that drew these artists together as a group, because all four of them were kind of drawing creative energies from one another. It's this back and forth that we've been seeing, and we're identifying it as a specifically collaborative process that was such an important dimension of their lives as artists. We can see it, that collaboration on many, many different levels. But as Nick says, the way they passed the camera around, the camera was not a proprietary item. It was something that was a tool for exploring their collective, interior, their collective worlds. This is Margaret and Paul in Provincetown in matching hoodies, maybe playing around with ideas that Jared had about the Jungian self, who knows, but they're rather enigmatic, but quite beautiful photographs. So you see them kind of generating together collectively this collaborative energy in which none of the three really are claiming sole authorship. And I think that's a really important point, that the name itself, which is made, as we saw, the first syllables of the first names of the three principles, that that name itself collapses three into one. So they're really one, working as one, and their very way of working suggests a kind of proto-postmodern erasure of the singular author. Before the postmodern turn itself, the idea of the privileged singular author, I think, is not really one that they were particularly interested in. But there's a second form of collaboration, I think, that is worth pointing out, which is that the ways in which they're using photography to act out some pretty demanding interpersonal dynamics in their own everyday lives. And so we sort of shift to specific biographical elements here. Photography offered them a way of kind of working at the boundary line between everyday real worlds in which they lived and worked, and then these more challenging realms of their own lives that they wanted to explore. I'm going to talk about these two images, but let me give you the background here, which is that many of the photographs that they made together and gifted to people in their private network, you see them actually enacting the tensions and the kind of uneasy power dynamics of their lives as a ménage à trois. So when I began to look at these intertwined lives of Paul and Margaret, Paul Cadmus, Margaret, and Jared French, you begin to look at their intertwined lives, living and working together in the summers, it becomes clear that they had a great deal to negotiate. When Margaret and Jared became romantically involved, their marriage interrupted a long love affair and partnership between Jared and Paul. So you kind of have to imagine living in a household with your wife or your husband and your former lover. That, you know, must have been a really challenging situation on a kind of daily basis. So you see here in this painting by Jared French, if we can just go back to that quickly, painting by Margaret French, of Jared, who's sort of sitting on a kind of trapeze-like hoop, looking down in a very magisterial way on these two smaller figures that seem to sort of allegorically refer to Margaret, who's very tall, and then the more diminished figure of Paul. So they were, you know, sort of treating themselves playfully as circus performers for Jared. And Jared was also, as you see on the photograph on the left, Jared was a very commanding figure in their lives. And you see in these three lay figures, this sort of, toying playfully and somewhat humorously, but damningly, the ways in which Jared was really sort of the commanding figure in their worlds. So with this in mind, I decided to focus on photography that the three principles made, which involve what I began to think of as a kind of play acting. And we've talked about that in other contexts. They were really engaging a form of play acting as they staged these photographs. But it was play acting about very serious adult matters as they're negotiating these tensions. And these images have a kind of, when you look at them, they have a kind of dramatistic flair, almost as if the three are deliberately assuming certain roles that they're playing. And Margaret, in this triad, Margaret seems to be the most theatrical in the way she's presenting herself in these photographs. She's striking poses that suggest anger, resentment. Here she is, pinioned between those two triangular forms, looking at Paul, gazing at Paul, and then Fidelma on the left, looking away. There's a strange kind of interpersonal tension there, but also staging or dramatizing a sense of desolation, a sense of withdrawal. She's sort of throwing herself against this post with Jared in the background. They're turned away from one another in this very dramatic setting of sea and surf. So it's a weird kind of staginess to these photographs that began to seem almost campy, almost bordering on camp at points. And then I began to think that maybe they're actually channeling popular genres such as film noir, which was a contemporaneous genre of Hollywood film noir, especially in an image like this, where you have George Tooker glowering over very high contrasty scene with Margaret in profile, and then very hard to see, but there's a little inset of Paul Cadmus. So again, these triadic configurations involving a different ménage à trois, because Cadmus and Tooker at that point were romantic partners as well. So here's just a film still from a William Wyler, German emigre, director in Hollywood, that begins to resemble, you can see that they're sort of maybe channeling and thinking about film noir in these years. So this quality of play acting really engaged my curiosity, because it seemed to, if you want to go back to that other one, it seemed to kind of fly in the face of the dominant assumption that we still continue to make about serious art in those years of the 40s and into the 50s, which is that serious art was about the revelation of self, of selfhood, that it was about expressing one's interior life. And these photographs really seem to be less about self-expression and more about what we came to think of as self-enactment. And I think the difference is that in self-enactment, one's position within a social group is shaping who one becomes at any particular moment. So it's a more fluid sense of a kind of interpersonal or intersubjective selfhood that is unstable. And within this very intimate social world that these artists all worked in, one's actions did affect others very directly, and no one acted alone. No one acted as an autonomous agent, either personally or interpersonally or artistically. Their interpersonal context of the self was very, very important.
I'm going to try and wrap this up so we have some time for questions, but one thing that was really important as Angela and I were talking about these artists was the realization that in the case of PaJaMa especially, maybe we're not talking about photographs per se, but about performances. And that point really led me to think of Lynes's work also as performances in the studio for the camera. And that freed me from thinking about the finality of each image. And given that Lynes made so many types of images, I became interested in reconstructing how one person could do that, what that would mean for the studio, and what that also says about the place and time that Lynes inhabited. So the studio turned out to be this very frenetic zone where you have fashion models coming in, ballet dancers, trade, cultural luminaries, in and out all day long. And I could start to imagine, once I strung these images together, as you see here, all using the same set, that someone like Lynes would use that kind of rhythm to his advantage, recycling elements from a fashion photo shoot and a ballet image and in a nude photograph, as you've seen. So in his hands, the studio becomes this place of successive performances that are not really separated from each other, but can now be seen as a sequence of worlds making contact over time. And, just to wrap things up a little bit, I think in our dialogue, Angela and I were really interested in the complex forms of authorship that these artists developed, that they proposed through their work and also in dialogue with each other, and how difficult they are even today for people to fully kind of grasp. I notice, and I think I pointed this out earlier, that someone like Lynes is consistently put back in the role of a traditional artist, even though his means are nothing but, they're anything but. And I think the same goes for PaJaMa, who really raises the question, as Angela has said, of the sort of definition or the boundaries of what an artist is, or whether that descriptor is even necessary to understand what it is that they're doing. And finally, something that interested both of us was the ways in which PaJaMa and Lynes's work relates to contemporary non-artistic practices that we all are engaging with on a daily basis, or even a minute-by-minute basis, which have to do with the ways in which we're constantly making images, consciously or unconsciously, different kinds of images of ourselves for different platforms, and how we kind of navigate that seamlessly.